Hello everyone, it's Friday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. This week has been a very busy one diplomatically as there was a gathering of leaders from the 21 APEC member economies. The highlight was, of course, the Biden-Xi Summit that took place at a country estate near San Francisco. There they agreed to resume military communications, but still many disagreements still remain. Meanwhile, the leaders of East Asian countries too have had busy schedules, with President Yoon and his Japanese counterpart Prime Minister Kishida had their 7th summit this year, while Kishida and Chinese leader Xi Jinping too shared their views on the need to revive the relationship. How did experts see this week of APEC leaders' meetings? For this, we have invited Professor Kim Jae-chun, who is also the Dean of the Sogang Graduate School of International Studies. Professor Kim, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
Thank you for being with us. And we also have Professor Mason Ritchie from Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to have you with us, Professor Ritchie.
Great, thank you. Happy to be here.
Good evening. Now, first question to our Professor Kim. The highlight of the APEC summit was the Biden-Xi Summit, as I said earlier, which was held at the Filoli Estate, California, which is around 40 kilometers away from San Francisco. Before we take a look at the specifics of the summit, could there have been any reasons behind the location being so far away from the city?
That Filoli Estate sort of reminded me of the place that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev picked for their summit in 1986. That summit was to bring an end to the Cold War order and to sort of reestablish the U.S.-Soviet relations. And the place for the summit was a very remote castle in Iceland, in Reykjavik, Iceland. So this was the place where you can keep a distance from hustle and bustle of the cities. And this was the place where you can have a frank discussion in a relaxed environment. So likewise, Filoli was a private estate, quiet, not really used as a diplomatic before. So by holding the summit in this private and remote estate, I think two leaders wanted to leave an impression that they would have a candid discussion to sort of reestablish their relationship. In addition, China wanted to have this bilateral summit quite earlier than the APEC summit, because they didn't want the summit to be overshadowed by APEC. Because, I mean, if you're holding the bilateral summit in the middle of APEC, it can be overshadowed by APEC and other bilateral summits.
Right, I see. So because the venue was in the remote area, they were able to have candid conversation. Now, Professor Ritchie, before the in-depth talks, Biden said the competition should not turn into conflict, to which she agreed, saying the Earth is big enough for the two countries to succeed. Against what backdrop do you believe the two are seeing the need to cooperate rather than aggravate tension?
Well, in the first place, in the international arena, there are a lot of crises that are at work right now, unfortunately. And, both sides, especially the U.S., I think, is eager not to have an additional crisis with China. And I'm sure China doesn't want to have an additional crisis with the U.S. There are already crises, of varying degrees and with varying, impact on the rest of the global sphere. In Ukraine, obviously, with the war being prosecuted by Russia there, in the Middle East, notably, obviously, Israel, but the possibility of spillover into a more region-wide conflict can't be excluded. In the South China Sea, of course, we've seen China and the Philippines confronting each other relatively recently. And then domestically, of course, and probably for Xi and Biden in some ways, this is more important. In the case of China, you have a weakening economy with lower growth prospects going forward. And to some degree, China's in something of a relatively weak position right now. Notably economically, but also on the political side, there are unsettled issues inside of the Chinese Communist Party, which we've seen bubbling up in terms of the very surprising dismissal and even disappearance of, for instance, the foreign minister recently, or the defense minister. And then in the case of the United States, there are upcoming congressional and presidential elections happening in 2024. And so obviously Biden doesn't want to have an additional China crisis as a black mark on a presidency that is already struggling as he looks to go into his re-election campaign.
Right, so both sides did not want to have another crisis because there are so many things to tackle already. And that led to some of the agreements, and one is reopening the military communication channels that Beijing had shut down after then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August 2022. Now, Professor Kim, could we say this reopening hints at lowered tension regarding military conflicts?
I think so. One problem with the recent U.S.-China competition was that the competition was taking place without any guardrails. I mean, even before Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last year, there was a sign that all the important communication channels were being shut down. You know, 2+2 strategic dialogues between foreign ministers and defense ministers of both countries were shut down. And other diplomatic and military channels were shut down as well. So shutting down that hotline after Pelosi's visit was like, to me, it was like a nail on the coffin. Now the two leaders agreed to restore the hotline and other working level military dialogues. I think that really means a lot because now they have a channel with which they can communicate and prevent accidental confrontations from escalating into serious flare-ups. So sure, two countries will compete, that's for sure. We all know that the two countries are in for a long and strategic competition for many, many years down the road. But at least they agreed to compete with some guardrails. And I think that's the significance of this summit and significance of restoring military channels.
Right, so it was significant indeed in that the hotline between the leaders were established again. But Professor Ritchie, though they certainly made progress in terms of restoring military communication, the two leaders had differing ideas about export controls. Apparently, Xi told Biden that investment screening and unilateral sanctions hurt Chinese interests, only to hear that the U.S. has no intention of lifting them. Could we say they could not reach an agreement on economic sanctions?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. You know, the United States doesn't seem to be showing any movement or willingness to move on the tech and trade side of U.S.-China confrontation. You know, the fact of the matter is, over the last decade, the United States has moved, in part because of what China has become, towards looking at China as a systemic rival and as a revisionist power in the international system, in the international arena. And that isn't going to change anytime soon without a dramatic ideological change and policy change by China, notably by the Chinese Communist Party. And that's not going to happen either. And there is no appetite right now in Washington for removing or relaxing the securitization of economics, whether that be export controls, whether that be the whether that be the way that the United States looks at intellectual property, whether that be the way that the United States looks at subsidies in China. The fact of the matter is the United States fundamentally believes that China is a systemic rival, is a revisionist power, but also even within the world of economic competition does so in part unfairly. And there's no appetite for the United States to relax that, at least not in Washington, especially as I mentioned earlier, we're going into a 2024 election cycle. I'll also point out, you know, we saw that bubble up when Biden was asked a question by a journalist and referred to Xi as a dictator correctly. But you know, that's that's what we call a Kinsley gaffe. He told the truth, but just in a setting in which everyone might have expected other leaders not to have said that. The United States and China also didn't seem to make any progress on discussions about artificial intelligence and putting some guardrails on how that's going to be used, notably in a defense and security context. And there were some lead-up discussions, for instance, about nuclear weapons, and we'll have to see where that goes in terms of possibility for arms control. But I have some very, very limited expectations for progress in that area as well.
Right, I see. Well, Professor Kim, another contentious issue they've spent a lot of time on was Taiwan. Biden reportedly asked China to respect the electoral process in Taiwan ahead of the presidential election set for January. How did you see the discussion between the two over the issue of Taiwan?
Taiwan is one of the thorny issues that separate the two countries. It was reported that China demanded that the U.S. officially declared that the U.S. doesn't support the independence of Taiwan. But to the United States, it was not acceptable because it undermines the U.S. policy for Taiwan, and that policy still is strategic ambiguity. China also demanded that the U.S. should not provide military support to Taiwanese, but this is also against the U.S.-Taiwan Act that provides a legal basis for arms sales to Taiwan. But look, sure, two countries have serious differences over Taiwan, but the simple matter of the fact is that to me, the U.S. doesn't support Taiwan's independence. What the U.S. wants is maintaining status quo. And Taiwan doesn't really want independence either. They want status quo as well. What about China? I don't think China is going to invade Taiwan to annex the island, because doing so could lead to military conflict that President Xi can really handle. Sure, you have to stand tough on Taiwan issue for maybe a domestic political purposes, and it's also a constitutional duty of the CCP. However, invading can be quite costly, so I think there is a tacit agreement between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, but for the reasons that are mostly political, they exchange harsh words. But two leaders, I think, in my personal opinion, understand each other's stance very well, and I don't think they would try to cross that red line.
Right, I see. Though the two countries agreed to cooperate on certain issues, for example, like narcotics, fentanyl and climate change, it seems they need to work more on certain issues like Taiwan and export controls, as our experts have already pointed out. Now, turning to how democratic countries are enhancing their ties to tackle tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the leaders of South Korea, the United States, and Japan met, and Biden said he was able to lighten his load thanks to South Korea and Japan. Professor Kim, what would such words have hinted at?
Well, you have to put it in the perspective of rules-based order, rules-based liberal international order that is in jeopardy now. In the post-World War II era, the U.S. established and maintained this rules-based liberal international order. But in recent years, this liberal order has been in jeopardy because a number of revisionist countries are trying to revise this international order to their preferences. For instance, Russia is attempting to rewrite the order by waging war in Ukraine, and China is interfering with rules-based order in the Pacific, and North Korea's nuclear threats are also important challenge to the existing order. The Biden administration has worked very hard to safeguard the liberal order, but the U.S. alone cannot deal with the threats to the liberal order in an adequate manner. The U.S. needs support from other liberal countries and allies. And in Asia, the U.S. was in desperate need of cooperation between South Korea and Japan, two important liberal allies, but this was not possible because of historical ill feelings between South Korea and Japan. But now, somehow two countries mended fences, and three countries established a security cooperation body after Camp David Summit. So I think it really was a load off the shoulder. From the perspective of the Biden administration.
Right. So U.S. is seeing Japan and South Korea as great partners in terms of setting and maintaining rules-based order in an international community. Well, Professor Ricci, many bilateral summits also took place. President Yoon and Kishida had their summit on Thursday local time, where they talked about how bilateral cooperation was deepening with the reactivation of exchanges at multiple levels. Their seventh summit this year. How did you see the talks?
Hey, this is really a continuation of ongoing improved relations between Tokyo and Seoul. There's no new major ground that was broken, but in some sense, that's a good thing, right? That means that they've already been making lots of progress in areas, whether that be security, whether that be defense, whether that be diplomacy, whether that be improved economic ties. And so we are seeing, Seoul and Tokyo, get over the problems of, their own economic clash that was taking place off and on over the last 10 years. On the security and defense front, we're seeing increasing military exercises with Japan participating in exercises, including South Korea. We're seeing ballistic missile defense cooperation, including real-time intelligence sharing on tracking of incoming North Korean missiles. It's worth pointing out that I assume that Yoon and Kishida talked about an upcoming potential trilateral with China as well. That's something that's potentially on the table. Presumably they're trying to set up a way that they can have a sort of united front as they deal with China. And of course, Yoon, Kishida, and Biden also met in a trilateral context. And it's important to remember that a lot of the improved relations between Tokyo and Seoul are coming on the back of the U.S. interest and willingness to advance trilateral cooperation as well. So certainly that was one of the things that was discussed also in the bilateral context between Yoon and Kishida.
All right, I see. Well, staying on Seoul-Tokyo ties, Professor Kim, at Stanford University, the two leaders are expected to announce the hydrogen ammonia global value chain concept on Friday local time as part of efforts to play a role in decarbonizing societies and also to secure the supply chains. What is this about, and in what ways do you believe this could be of help to both of these energy-dependent countries?
South Korea and Japan are still heavily dependent on energy imports, particularly fossil fuels from other countries. And that idea of hydrogen and ammonia global value chain is really for two countries to work together to establish a joint supply network for alternative fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia. I think the idea is still in incipient stage, so we have yet to find out details of the concept, how the concept will translate into policy practices. But the idea is really to raise funds for hydrogen and ammonia projects, joint projects to be more precise, and financial institutions in both countries will support these companies to raise such funds. If the concept is materialized, it could help both countries in terms of diversifying energy sources and decarbonization. The concept is also about keeping the momentum going. I mean, the momentum to restore and advance the relationship between the two countries. And this was what two countries agreed to do since the beginning of this year.
Right. Well, we'll have to wait and see how the details get developed, but I think it is quite significant indeed. Well, Professor Ricci, Japan and China's leaders also had their summit for the first time in a year on Thursday, where they discussed ways to revive the strategic relationship. What was mainly discussed, and would it be safe to say such meetings would lay the foundations for a trilateral summit between Seoul, Beijing, and Tokyo?
Yeah, so certainly that would have been one of the things that was under discussion. I have no privileged information about what came of that, and I've been busy today and haven't seen any specific reporting, at least, that indicated whether or not this did or didn't help move towards the establishment of a possible trilateral summit. Obviously, this is an important secondary relationship that has soured off and on over the last 10 to 15 years, especially. with friction over economics, with friction over security, and any other number of areas. In this particular case, there are, in addition to some of the economic issues that are stumbling blocks in their relationship, there are a number of Japanese businessmen who are being detained in China. And the thought there is that these detentions are likely trumped up and probably not legitimate. So that might have been something that was discussed today and could represent, if they made some progress, a way of getting over some of the problems in the relationship. The other thing, of course, is Fukushima and the Chinese ban on Japanese seafood imports from that area. So that probably was something that was under discussion as well. It's not quite as important overall as getting the U.S. and China on the same page, but putting a floor on relations between Japan and China is excellent for regional security as well.
All right, I see. Well, I'd like to ask many more questions to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Ritchie, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be next Monday with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the weekend, and goodbye.